It's hard to believe Zootopia 2 is already a year away from this video's posting, where it comes almost a decade after the original's release. An interesting world that wants to speak about modern times in an anthropomorphic animal setting of characters Disney has been best known for doing over the last century, manifested into an entire society in itself. And its ideas is a perfect haven for both heroes and villains to take their place as much as the real world does have their own, on the streets or even up in the highest places of the government. But due to Disney being Disney at the time, not everything was great for a film like Zootopia, especially that of its own villain that was a part of their weirdly bad twist villain era. With films that were financially successful on their own and still enjoyed for the moments we love today that took Disney into its illustrious 3D era, but not satisfying in their villain department that has become a staple of Disney good triumphing over evil brand. Villains that mostly happen to take place in modern settings that need to appear as good as can be, except for the best and the only one that took place in the historical fairy tale setting, which thankfully capped off this era with the last of its kind in a character known as Don Bellwether, the assistant to the mayor who becomes the mayor later on and is behind the entire plot to make the prey dominate the predators. The first listed surprise female villain in the entire studio that they've ever done, and frankly one of the most stupidest if you realize how short of a role it really is in terms of being a villain. Because as a character, she does show up from time to time ever since the start of Judy Hopps' cop career, but not enough to be justified as an opposing threat, hardly feeling like it's needed, or the fact that most general audiences could even remember such a character if you're not that big a fan of the movie or its world. Like at the very least, you can remember the face of Yokai before Callahan appeared under the mask as Hero's biggest threat, and then Hans, who was a prince who connected with Anna since the very beginning and had a real large part of the actual story so far than she actually did. To give them credit at least, they did make her design cleverly disguised so you wouldn't actually notice that feature, but its writing felt like it wasn't great enough to focus on. As we enter Zootopia, we enter a world that opens up to new people getting into roles they wouldn't have thought had fit them, like Judy Hopps, approaching the themes of prejudice and learning to overcome them, having the assistant mayor cheer her on before being that same type of prey species, making way for the little guy. The overall theme of Zootopia having prejudice in society that isn't good for any person of the evils that may entail with it, when that disallows others to be active members or even great pieces of that very society. That we are meant to show a character like a small sheep relate to Judy in her own way, even though she's elevated to assistant mayor, to realize that there's more than meets the eye and that we can work together as an entire group of people, showcasing how Lionheart is the big lion in town running things like a predator, similar how we normally perceive them as king of the jungle since Lion King itself showed that being the most popular traditional animated Disney film. But anyways, you see how he values his own assistant being that small sheep, pushing her aside to take photos with Judy as the main source of conflict present that they must all face. You know, big versus small, all information that points to the future of the fact of when all is revealed, that she is supposed to be the darker half of Judy, just like how they described Callahan to Hero back in Big Hero 6, and how those characters conflict with these types of stories meant to have the heroic parallels of people willing to do whatever it takes to get their goal, whether it be good or bad depending on the level they handle their own grief. But that grief isn't handled properly at all in any of these films when it's so short, when there's hardly enough reason for them to exist as much as the collection of side characters that also pop up from time to time. Like literally, if you watch it back, you can realize what I'm talking about in the variety of animals that show up in the film's premise that is almost about equal as our own entire screen time. A baffling choice if you ask me, counting again the other two villains who appear more, combining both the masked and unmasked appearances to demonstrate that. Like you really have to include that because they are a major part of the plot, where instead, to make her look like the good guy in favor of Judy with her small demeanor against those like Chief Bogo, who for the most part was against the likes of Judy, being a part of this force with the meaningless task handed to her and reprimanded for insubordination, volunteering without approval, threatening to have her resign if she can't solve such a difficult case within 2 days. Things that actually point to the fact that this society does not look up upon having these short little bunnies being a part of the force that requires strength or skill or whatever people may apply to a certain person, gender, race, or sexuality. It's one of those painful problems we keep seeing in Disney's twisted era that makes one character look like the major source of conflict when it's actually not revealing that they are good at heart. Not the fact that I actually mean that he should have been the villain, but more so that there is a redirect of conflict to something else. The plot meaning to distract you on the bigger issue of the big versus small animals, thinking one cannot serve as much as the other, with Lionheart as that figurehead who takes the fall later after Bellwether helped Judy out, knowing that the predators were imprisoned while he was trying to contain and solve the outbreak under his nose. Deeper, darker circumstances to control this, even though it's not the case of him making the villain, making him look like the initial bad guy doing the crime, slowly peeling the layers that this buddy cop movie was aiming for in the darker truth of how society works, but but not really revealing much after this, because when we speak of this, it's not necessarily wrong to have such features in a film, but an idea can only take you so far as what you're able to understand, because the name Bellwether was chosen for a specific reason, even especially as a villain, where weather usually refers to sheeps and how that bell is put around them to be leaders, and frankly how weathers are mainly referring to males, to be honest, if they were going with something that puts the female in charge, but in the opposite direction. And then its name also mainly applies to those in politics of how a group of people would vote in a certain place that matches the bigger populace at large for the final result, more and so at how it determines where things should be headed in the middle ground of a society. So when she is finally elevated to the position of mayor, she offers to reward Judy for her efforts to be the face of Zootopia's police department in favor of praise, making them heroes and actually wanted in their own society. But how she feels different in this case because she knows Nick, who is a predator, is feeling offended by her own findings even after they connected to what they were bullied at a young age, demeaning a group of entire people, where she expresses shock at this decision, knowing she worked hard to get here, but not to the point where she feels desperate to keep her after wanting to put her in a position as much as any other small type of prey animals. In keeping with these secret themes, I just didn't feel like they gave her enough to sell the endpoint of that very reveal, to realize that there's more to her position and character other than visual cues and other points of her personality that foreshadows an overall darker picture. Just enough that sells us on this fact that she is behind some big nefarious plot. So our next move after this is actually coming to the end of the film, where after they find this real evidence to showcase the crime is when she appears to Nick and Judy applauding their own efforts to bring the briefcase to them, until Judy herself realized how she even did manage to find them in the first place when they didn't even call her. So with the snap of the finger, she immediately becomes the overarching antagonist all along, chasing them down from stopping her malicious plan. A shift that just doesn't work quite as good as you would think, on the basis that it switches from a good-hearted person who supported the hero throughout the entire film to a maniacal villain who sadistically revels in the killing of a fellow prey species by turning another predator against them. That the end result turns to be the lust for power every person who works within the government wants, rising to the top by keeping everyone down simply through the fact of instilling fear of a supposedly natural instinct that predators have, killing prey down the endless food chain in the circle of life, to make the other half rule by wasting the other bigger bosses of Zootopia society into mindless killing machines, if that makes any sense to you. I mean, to be fair, it kind of does, but not as much as it really should. Like, looking back now upon it, I find its twist making much more logical sense than the other two we keep mentioning because of the plot that is involved within the cop world and how such characters actually interact. It really isn't a bad idea to have these such things, but the other circumstances involved in the sole basis of screen time interactions affect how it can play out in good or bad ways, mostly bad ways in this case. All for her to become the darker half of the character who felt affected by the predators wanting to make them ostracized outside so they can rule to be safe to live. But this is where you have to note, there was hardly enough real information to connect to that plot. If you look at King Candy as the prime candidate for these types of villains that should work, you still have a complete reason to why they act the way that they do. They're already explained at the very beginning, and they have a certain backstory explained about them that got them to this certain position, instead of having her here and explain some level of frustration to make predators turn against prey. Like, you can get a great parallel from that, focusing on Judy's early childhood to her actual own, and understand the better half to act behind the scenes, to have some better sense of clues instead of focusing on having others play that part and not believing what Judy represents like Chief Bogo. Again, I'm not trying to say you have to set him as the main antagonistic threat, no, but a situation that presents a greater reason to work against her own goals. I'm not the smartest person to even delve into these situations as presented in the main subject matter of Zootopia. I admit there's actually more that can say better than I could ever talk about this, but I just want to talk about this with the feeling that such a character was more put on a back burner. Villains can come in different circumstances, but the best ones are the ones you can understand while simultaneously denouncing their own actions, and feel they're memorable as much as the hero they're talking about. It feels like nothing important was either gained or lost with her addition wailing around in prison at the end, fuming like an angry child with such a quick defeat minutes after her own dark reveal. Just think about it for a second. Compared to her other counterparts, she is featured the very least. There's no meet and greets in the parks or other official Disney places, and of course their content they consume are not even featured, and nobody even really cares to bring her up often when talking about this movie. The signs that she was not in fact very good or even a necessary villain in the first place. Again, she was necessary in the fact of the plot moving forward, but not really much in the entire branch of what Zootopia is meant to its audience, twisted in the way it's supposed to be shown for something they apparently thought modern cinema would like at the time, doing it constantly, but knowing when you do it constantly, you keep failing. But if they found some way to include better motivations, she wouldn't be that bad either, instead of just being forgettable overall, playing an understandable and more important part of Zootopia itself. Moreover, it's a similar problem opposed to that of other powerful characters that already have the position they want, that Disney didn't look past itself to realize, just like Magnifico once again mentioning someone who already is at the top being the king, but doesn't have a proper journey to explain to hold on to that power or even gain more that they have. I mean, they could have done it, but they just never gave any reason because time was short, or they didn't even care just soon enough. Because if you're already there, you better have a good reason to move on up. Again, at the very least, it did have one way to move on up in some way, to throw you off from a guy who actually wasn't that bad of a character either in Lionheart, especially for the fact he did the wrong reasons but in service of the good reasons to stop people turning into savages beyond their own control. Because honestly, if you had time to explain the backstory of Nick after Judy's own later in the film, why couldn't you have just done so for Bellwether being that certain way? Where if you think you should sympathize with her as a character, you should need to know more about what they really drives them in the first place, right? It's hard to digest the real reason at the end if it wasn't such a bigger idea at play, trying to wipe out half the populace if that made any sense. I mean, sure, it worked for Thanos and what he thought, but that actually had more explanations, and this seemed like a bad idea overall that lacked that certain substance in a goal that was mainly being pushed for equality instead of doing a complete 180 into evil power-hungry tyrant. But at the end of all things, I must admit, I could really be overall wrong about this. Some actually may like how things end up in the very moment of rewarding Nick and Judy's own story as friends, and that's completely fine by the way you see it, but I just can't feel enough when the quality of characters just go unnoticed today, that many people do not utter the name Bellwether unless they talk about the twist factor or, you know, something else that happened there, that they aren't remembered under a certain collection because they lack that certain charm that most heroes accomplish during their journey we endlessly love to talk about, against their own villains that become the most powerful yet the weakest in all of society, and sustained on this channel to really appreciate what they bring to each film. Like everything that has to do with Zootopia, it more deals with a matter of perception, where if one appears some certain way or the other, and if you think this is not true, then I really would respect that, which is the end goal of what Zootopia should strive for, and learning how others can be better at the end of it all. I thank you all for watching this, and now this is all done. Goodbye.